This podcast contains adult language and a candid discussion on post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. The content may be triggering to some. Please take this into consideration before listening. This is Powerful Conversations Humanhood, a podcast where we confront America's adopted psychopathic nature by diving headfirst into difficult and honest conversations about the state of humanhood. I'm your host, Tamara Graham, with co-host Leisha Moody Miller. We welcome you to the conversation. This episode is sponsored by Square 5, powerful products that confronts our internal dialogue to help inspire our external dialogue for a more purposeful, driven world. Command your voice at square5.com. That's SQUARE5IVE.com. Post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, can cause debilitating symptoms. But it's important to understand that recovery is possible. There are protective factors that we develop in childhood that can limit PTSD symptoms, and there is post-traumatic growth that also occurs following healing. In today's podcast, we delve into the protective factors and then healing and growth following PTSD. We also discuss the important role of boundaries and self-reflection in healing. Trauma comes in many forms, and each person's journey is an individual one. But understanding key concepts in protection, healing, and growth can not only be a guide, but support to those suffering from the effects of trauma and to those who love them.
So today I thought based on our previous discussions around trauma, Tamara and I thought it might be really useful to people to hear about trauma recovery and what that looks like, and also what it looks like to be resilient from trauma and how that can add to your trauma recovery as well. Many times we talk about PTSD and stress-related disorders in terms of the symptoms that a person displays and the symptoms that they experience. But there has been a lot of focus and new research around what does it look like when a person has grown from their traumatic experience, has moved beyond healing to a place of real growth. So healing from trauma is definitely attainable. But now there's actual research going into what does growth after trauma look like. So we're going to delve a little bit more into that today. I wanted to talk first about just recapping what childhood trauma looks like in terms of what it can be. Trauma can be an incident, an experience that is short in terms of length of time. This could be, for example, a child that goes through a tornado or experiences 9/11, or there's a fire or the death of a loved one. That's what we call acute trauma. There's also something called complex trauma. And complex trauma is really more about trauma that occurs in many ways over a much longer period of time. And complex trauma could involve multiple events of different sorts. It could involve many years of re-experiencing the same type of trauma from the same type of perpetrator, or it could be many different types of trauma compounded together over the course of childhood. And complex trauma is often also attributed to children who experience early childhood trauma and what we would call developmental trauma. So as we all know, that basically the attachment that occurs in childhood is critical to a child's development. And if that attachment is interrupted or disrupted in some way, it can lead to developmental trauma, either through abuse, neglect, emotional abuse, separation from a caregiver, lack of caregiver. I mean, there's any number of ways that attachment can be disrupted. And once that occurs, a child's earliest experiences become traumatic, then sometimes that's referred to as developmental trauma. you can really kind of classify that often as complex trauma as well. But for the purposes of discussion, I just wanted to remind everyone that PTSD can occur with acute trauma or with complex trauma. A person does not have to experience a series of multiple events and multiple time frames over their lifetime of childhood to experience PTSD.
It could even be just like a car accident or something. It could be
Correct.
something small or, that we would think is small, a
Right.
particular or individual or incident.
Absolutely. And what we sometimes do is we sometimes try to, as we talked about, it's very important we don't qualify or classify other people's trauma because we're not in that experience. And a person that experiences a very impactful event that may seem small to you, it is not necessarily small to them. And so they can definitely develop PTSD from that. And so when we talk about what does it look like to be resilient through childhood trauma, whether that be acute trauma or complex trauma or developmental trauma? What does it look like to be resilient? And so I pulled an article from Child Trends and I'll post the link on our page. But first of all, they define resilience as a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. So basically, what we're talking about is a process that occurs where you actually adapt and are able to come through a significant adversity and actually have some protection from that event. So, resilience is not necessarily a trait that somebody inherits. It really is something that you're given through protective factors. And so I just wanted to kind of highlight those real quick.
Yeah, what are protective factors? What does that mean?
They are things that promote healthy development and minimize the risk or negative outcomes. So they protect you from the risk associated with a trauma event. Just like a child is at risk in certain ways because of certain factors in their life, a child can also be protected in certain ways because of certain conditions or characteristics or events in their life. So the good news is that we all have the ability to understand those protective factors. And if we know of a child who's experienced trauma, we can use those to instill a counterbalance to some of the adversity that they're going through and protect and perhaps protect them from severe trauma.
What exactly are protective factors, though? Can you give a couple of examples as to what that is?
Oh yeah, I'm going to give you
Are
all of
they
them.
external or are they from other people or are they internal within someone?
Both. They're external, they're situations, they're people, they're characteristics that maybe you develop at an early age, but also come sometimes from our environment, and they're coping skills. So, for example, one protective factor that the National Traumatic Stress Network highlighted. So, the National Traumatic Stress Network, I don't know if the listeners remember, but I mentioned Bruce Duncan Perry in one of our episodes and his work on trauma, and he actually founded the National Traumatic Stress Network. And they developed this list of protective factors that promote resilience in childhood trauma. So a child certainly may not have all of these, but the more protective factors you have, the more protected you are from trauma. So if a traumatic event occurs or a series of events occur, you're more likely to bounce back and come through it less harmed. So the first one is support from family, friends, people at school, and members of the community. Support. That seems so simple, doesn't it?
It does seem simple, and I think it just lacks for so many children. I mean, even in a school environment, I think teachers and administrators are better at recognizing this stuff today. But as we learned in a previous podcast, when we were talking about the book banning, our guest Mary Jane had stated outright that the parents in her school district don't want mental health support for their children at the school district level.
Right.
They say they don't anyway, though they truly do. If something were to happen to their child, they would definitely want that support network there.
But you're right. If a child doesn't have support from friends or from family or the community, maybe the only place they're getting support is at school. And that's important. That's so important.
Critical.
And so many children talk about, they had that one teacher who supported them and impacted their life. And I often think about, the protective factors that teachers are able to give to their students just by being there and listening.
Absolutely.
And as a family member, it is absolutely critical that we support our children, and no matter what they share with us, that we are supportive and we are empathetic, and as family, that seems like it would be a natural thing to do. But as family members and as a society, we often want to sweep under the rug anything that's traumatic and not talk about it in the family because it tends to make us feel bad, and we don't want to feel bad.
And if you come from an abusive environment, your family is not going to talk about it. Your family
No.
is going to ignore it or push it, as you said, under the rug. When I was growing up in an abusive environment with my father, immediate family never did anything about it. Most immediate family. The one person who was there for me, regardless, was my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. She was there, bless her, because
She was your protective
she
factor.
was. And without her, I probably wouldn't have survived childhood, and I am not exaggerating. Because when I was growing up and I had suicidal ideation, she is the only reason why I didn't do it. She's the only reason
Wow.
because I put myself in the position of thinking, "What would this do to her?" I was strong enough and aware enough as a child to ask myself that question, "What would this do to her?" And it's the only reason why I didn't do it. My immediate family, my aunts and uncles, my mother, my mother was in the same environment that I was in, and she was having much worse things done to her, but immediate family members talked about it, but they didn't do a damn thing about it. So for a child who is coming from an abusive environment in the family, someone from the outside or someone from school is their best bet. Having support from someone at the school level, from a teacher, from someone an administrator is critical.
And also people in the community, if you have a neighbor that you trust or someone that you know that runs a local store that takes an interest in you and gives you summer jobs. There's so many ways that we can impact kids in a positive way in our interactions with them.
Yeah, and it's so important for us to as a society to become aware of what that looks like and not ignore it. Like, if we see a child in distress, I think it's very obvious that more often than not that you can tell when a child is being abused, and just to be cognizant of that and to be aware of that as an adult just living in the society that we live in, to recognize that and say something if you notice something.
Yes. The next one is a sense of safety at home, at school, and in the community. So we know that the number one thing you need when you're experiencing trauma is safety. And if you can't get it at home or if you can't get it at school or in the community, you need to be getting it somewhere, ideally in all those places. But a child needs to be able to feel safe somewhere in their life, like you felt with your grandmother. It's critical if they're going through trauma to have that safety. High self-esteem and positive sense of self-worth is another protective factor. And I was thinking about this one and I was like, high self-esteem, that's hard to find
It is
nowadays.
limited. It's a limited in people, period, let alone
I mean,
children.
there is an epidemic of depression in teenagers right now, and I would imagine a lot of those teenagers are struggling with their self-esteem. There's a lot of bullying issues right now. There's a lot of comparison based on online content to others, and it saddens me for our youth because we don't often see a teenager who's really not cocky or arrogant, but just is confident.
Yeah.
Comfortable in their own skin.
I have a teenage son, and I can tell you he struggles with this.
A
Yeah, he
lot do,
struggles with
yeah,
it, and if you would look at him on the surface, there's no reason for him to struggle with it, but he struggles with it.
absolutely. A lot do. Because, I mean, we know it's a serious problem right now. So the next one is self-efficacy. It refers to an individual's belief that in their capacity to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific performance attainments. So basically, if I have self-efficacy, I believe in my skill and I believe I can execute my skill, whatever that is. If I believe I'm smart, then I can execute that in school. If I believe I'm musical, I can execute that. So it's taking what you know to be true about yourself and moving it into action.
That ties into number 3 with self-esteem, because I
Right.
think in order to believe in yourself, You have to have a very high level of self-confidence in order to
Mhm.
execute something. So if you're lacking in self-esteem, you're gonna be driven by fear and not necessarily not be able to, but you're going to struggle with self-efficacy.
Absolutely. We're very acutely aware that a lot of kids struggle with that. The next one is spiritual or cultural beliefs, goals or dreams for the future that provide a sense of meaning to the child's life. So, meaning is a big question we're all struggling with, but believing in what is life about, wherever you get that information from. Sometimes it's from your cultural experiences, sometimes it's from your religion, sometimes it's from your whole family culture, where your family is belief that we are here to do good work or we are here to make the world a better place, whatever it may be. But the more beliefs that a child can carry with them about the meaning of their life and the purpose of their life, the more protective it is if they experience trauma. A talent or skill in a particular area, so children that have something that they're really good at, and it doesn't have to be master level good, but if they're skilled in something, and this is where, we can really support children's self-esteem is if your child finds something they're good at, support that and encourage that. Not every child is good in school, not every child is good in art or music, but they all have things that they excel in. And having a skill that like that gives them an outlet and it's a good protective factor. And the last one is very ubiquitous as well. It's called coping skills that can be applied to varying situations. And so it really ties in with a lot of these other things too. But a child that can cope with adversity and that has skills to cope with adversity, this is why it's so important. I noticed that a lot of schools are now teaching ways to be present in the moment, like mindfulness. That is super important because that's a coping skill. I used to do this thing. I used to go in schools and do groups and with some of the children, and we would start every group with a meditative practice of coloring mandalas. You know what a mandala is?
Yes.
I would pass them out to the group of teenagers, and we would sit there, and they could talk if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. We would just sit there and color for about 15 minutes. And you would not believe the level of centeredness that gave them before we started our actual
I believe that
discussion.
coloring is actually very therapeutic.
Absolutely. And so there's all kinds of coping skills that kids can learn at a young age that will help them. And, deep breathing exercises are so easy to learn and they're so easy to teach, but we don't assume that that's a necessary skill that people need. But it is a necessary skill for protection from trauma and resilience.
Well, I think with all of these, I don't think most adults have a grasp on this in our society, let alone expecting children to have this and be growing up in an environment where they have access to all of this. Where are children actually learning their self-worth? Where are children learning their self-efficacy? How safe do children really feel in their home when abuse rates are so high? I think the one area out of all of these that I think fits children the best and how they cope with things is number 6, talent or skill. Because a lot of kids are in sports or multiple activities, and if they have that outlet, it's a great way for them to cope with something abusive. Mine was sports, mine was books, mine was work. Those are the ways that I escaped from my life, not even school. I hated school. I hated high school and junior high, and in particular, I don't hate school. I loved college and graduate school, but I hated growing up in school, and I think it 100% had to do with the fact that I had no self-worth because of the way that I was being raised and the environment that I was being raised in. I didn't feel a sense of safety. Now that you bring it up, the one place I did was with my grandmother, and I've always known that about her. I call that woman my savior. She's passed away 17 years ago already now. I miss her every day. I swear I think about her nearly every day. I didn't have high self-esteem. I didn't have self-efficacy. I didn't believe in myself at all growing up. I grew up in a Catholic environment, which I didn't believe in at all growing up either. the talent or skill, like I said, I would focus on sports. And when I couldn't play sports anymore because I had to take care of my brother, I was reading books or I was working, and that was my escape. And coping skills, I think it's very interesting for kids who grow up in an environment where they're experiencing trauma or they're depressed or whatever their situation is. There's this saying that kids are resilient, and I believe kids are resilient. And I think we kind of develop our own coping skills, and that kind of ties into number 6, I think, but they're not necessarily healthy coping skills.
No,
And they're coping
exactly.
skills that we take into adulthood that don't work in adulthood. So, my question with this is it's such an important thing for kids, but how are kids learning this? And how can kids learn this when most adults are not aware of this and most adults don't practice this?
Well, that is where there is a huge push for trauma informed care. And what that means is there's a huge push to educate all of the systems that come in contact with children, to talk to them about trauma, what it looks like, how to recognize it, and then also talk to them about their role in being a protective factor in that child's life. And we really have not fully been able to do that yet, but it's in process. I mean, schools can now register as trauma informed schools.
What does that mean though? If they register as a trauma informed school, do they get special training?
They get special training around trauma and around protective factors from trauma. They put in the work to get those extra educational pieces to be fully educated. But it also applies to doctors' offices, pediatricians' office, pediatric dentists, the juvenile justice system, children's activities. I mean, there's no limit to how far trauma informed care can go because it really applies to anywhere in the community the child is interacting with. The problem is some people don't see the importance of being a trauma informed system of care. They may not find it useful in their current regimen to add that piece. But I think it really is the way of the future to become acutely aware of trauma in every situation we're in and what being a protective factor for that traumatized person looks like in every system of care. I don't have to be treating the trauma to be trauma informed. Trauma informed means that when I interact with you, I'm trauma informed. I realize
You could recognize it.
that,
You can recognize it and know how to deal with it.
and I can also recognize what I can do, what boundaries I need to have with you
Right.
to for help you feel safe.
Right. Gosh, that's so key. That's so key.
So key. I mean,
Boundaries are so key, and it is just something we do not practice.
if I'm trauma informed, I am not going to come up and hug you without your permission. If we are strangers. I mean, if we've
Right.
known each other for years and been hugging for years, that's different.
Right.
If I'm trauma informed, I don't just walk up to you and put my arms around you.
Gosh, people struggle to do that with people they know, honestly.
Oh, let me tell you, the one thing I had after a trauma was I had this huge physical boundary, right?
Yeah,
Totally understandable.
totally, completely understandable.
I did not want anybody touching me in the most benign ways, no matter what. And I used to know this person who would come up and pick lint off my clothes all the
Oh my
time.
goodness.
It made me so uncomfortable. They wouldn't ask, "Oh, can I pick the lint off your clothes?" They just do it. Now, they didn't know my trauma history. I didn't tell them my trauma history, but they also didn't realize that they might be crossing a boundary with me. And if they were trauma informed, they would have known, perhaps I don't know every experience Leisha's had, and maybe I shouldn't come and pick lint off her clothing without asking.
Absolutely. Well, that's a good point, actually, just dealing with people in general in society is ask first.
Yes.
Don't even just assume because you're comfortable with something that everybody is comfortable or everybody around you is comfortable with it or has the same experience regarding it. Ask first. Ask if it's okay, to do something, to take the lint off you. Ask if it's okay to give you a hug. Ask if it's okay to sit next to you and, learn what people's boundaries are. I think that's such a huge and such an important point because we do not live with boundaries in this country. Very few people do. And I've said in a previous podcast, I've struggled with boundaries because I grew up with zero boundaries. The adults around me
Right.
did whatever the hell they wanted and said whatever they wanted. They never asked permission. They didn't care how I felt. They didn't care how anybody felt. They just did what they did. So I grew up not having boundaries myself. And as an adult, I have struggled with holding boundaries. I know when my boundaries are crossed, but I may not even be able to, well, I can now, but there's several decades of my life where I couldn't even tell you what a boundary was for me. But you knew when you crossed one, and I learned probably at the same moment when you crossed one. So it's such an important thing that we really teach kids to have boundaries and that adults teach themselves and we teach each other that boundaries are incredibly important. And it can be even to the point of just using a name or calling someone a name. Or even using pronouns, for an example. It could be
Right.
something very simple. It's just a matter of respecting the person that you're interacting with.
I know. There's definitely a lot of boundary crossings going on online
I
that
don't think
I'm
there's
very
boundaries on social
concerned
media at
about.
all. They don't
I know.
exist.
Yeah,
Boundaries
they
on
don't
social media
exist.
do not exist. People feel so emboldened to say whatever the hell they want on
Say
social media.
whatever they want to say in your
And they
comment.
threaten
I
people's
mean,
lives. They feel emboldened to threaten lives if they don't agree with somebody.
it's very disturbing. And I think it's a trend that's going to lead to a lot of, honestly, trauma for people who are creators and who maybe have to deal with that kind of thing on a regular
I think
basis.
it already does. But here's the positive side of that is a lot of creators have started calling people out by reposting the stuff that they're getting from people. And they've started to not cross out the name of the person that sent them the information. They're showing their profile name in their photos. I'm seeing that a lot more these days. It's happened, I think, ongoing, but people used to cross things out and when they would post things, or they would just say, I'm like that. It's like I'll have conversations with people online that'll trigger me, you know? And I'll, like, make a post about it, like, expressing a feeling about it. I've never, like, explicitly called someone out by posting the stuff that they've sent me or the conversations that they have, but I've started seeing that more and more. And the more I think about that, the more of a positive I think it is, because one of the things that I think empower these people is that they're anonymous.
Yeah.
And they feel anonymous even if they're not, and one thing that people should have learned, because it's really happened a lot the past couple of years, the couple of people that I follow on social media, it's called doxing, right? Where they have, like,
Right.
their whole platform is about doxing and calling people out, and people's businesses have been ruined over this because of how they have come out attacking people online, threatening people, and these people are fighting back by exposing them, and they're losing their businesses and they're losing their standings in the community. A lot of people like to call it cancel culture. In those instances, it's consequence culture. You're doing or saying something, you're crossing a boundary, and you're threatening people's lives or threatening their families or threatening something with them. You're not being canceled. You're being held accountable for your words and your actions. You've crossed a boundary. And so people are learning sometimes a very hard lesson about what having a boundary actually looks like. And it's a lesson that we need to learn.
Absolutely, because we don't know what other people have experienced. And one of the blessings or one of the great things about grad school for me in counseling was we talked a lot about boundaries with our clients. And there's a lot of ethical rules around boundaries with clients. And there's a lot of discussion about boundaries. And I learned about healthy boundaries that way through grad school, and working with clients. But I did not grow up. I grew up with very loose or what we call a mesh boundaries, which means there was not a lot of distinction between my parents and me. We kind of all, I basically was privy to a lot more information about my parents' marriage than I should have been.
Right on. I can relate to that.
And so I became a person who was like not very good at setting boundaries with people either. And I was a people pleaser. I didn't want to set boundaries because I didn't want to piss anybody off. So even though I learned those things in graduate school and working with clients, it still has been a struggle in my personal life to rectify that. It's taken a lot of therapy and a lot of work for me to understand and really hold to my personal boundaries in my personal
I'm getting
life.
a lot better with it as well, but I'm consciously setting them now, and I'm doing it for my
Yes.
own mental health because like you,
Exactly.
I'm a people pleaser. May seem shocking to some, but I am.
Well, I think, it's never too late to learn those things. And I mean, even though it's taken me, 5 decades, I still feel like I'm learning how to set personal boundaries. And I still feel like I have a lot more to learn and a lot more to practice, because it takes practice, to really have boundaries and stick with them.
It's almost easier to recognize that in other people than it is in ourselves.
Oh, yeah.
And I can respect other people's boundaries. And I have an immense amount of respect for people when they have boundaries and they tell me no to something. And it truly doesn't bother me and honestly doesn't. But when the tables are turned, I feel guilty. Well, I have in the past felt guilty for telling people no.
Yeah.
But telling them no is better for me 9 times out of 10.
And you feel guilty because you're afraid of what?
I think honestly that goes back to my childhood trauma where they wouldn't like me. But it's a subconscious thing. It's not a conscious thing for me because
No.
consciously I don't care if somebody doesn't like me. I truly don't. But on a subconscious level, that little girl who had to fight for love and her self-worth has a problem with it. So it's a
Right.
subconscious reaction for me and not a conscious reaction for me. Because I truly live
Exactly.
my life. Gosh, if I lived my life how everybody in my family told me I should live my life, I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation right now, that's for sure.
No, you wouldn't.
So I've always lived my life based on what I want and not what other people think. Based on what my goals are and not what other people's goals are for me. I've always lived my life that way, and I teach my son to live life the same way. And he wouldn't be doing what he's doing if I cared about what everybody else thought about us or how I raise him or, living life going toward dreams and accomplishments. So there's that
Right.
factor of it, which is my conscious level, but the unconscious part of me, that's where the guilt comes in and the shame comes in to where, that person's not going to like me if I don't say yes,
Mhm.
which is really interesting.
Well, it's said that we have a public persona and a private persona, and we really have windows of perception into what we see in ourselves and what we see in others. And oftentimes, it's easier to see things in other people than it is in ourselves. And it definitely, when it comes to our thought processes and our subconscious processes that seem to just come out without us knowing, those projections that we have and those idiosyncrasies that come out, and we're not even aware of how much they come out. It's definitely true that it's harder to see, to truly honestly perceive ourselves in an honest way. It's much harder. But that's the work of self-reflection and really healing yourself. It's really to see yourself honestly, but it's not easy to do.
Yeah, and it's such an important thing, and that's something that I'm really focusing on a lot more over the past couple of years is self-reflection, questioning my own beliefs, and solitude is something I have 0 problem with. I love my alone time, and I fight for my alone time. In my alone time, my perfect alone time is me out in the middle of the woods hiking somewhere with my dog. That for me that's my sanctuary, that's my church. That's where I become grounded. That's where I think through pretty much everything I think through in life. That's how I take my self-reflection and the questions and I allow it to guide me to the direction I really want to go. And I reinforce myself that way. And then it allows me to keep that focus internally on myself versus all of the things externally that can and do go wrong on a daily basis. And there's tons of stuff that go wrong on a daily basis, even just like with doing this podcast, the amount of issues that we run into constantly with this thing, would make it easy for some people to say, my gosh, this is so much work and this is so much trouble and I'm not going to deal with it, type of thing. But the more challenging for me, the better, honestly, because I kind of thrive in that environment. And that's probably a trauma thing, honestly, too. Honestly, I think
Yeah.
everything about me honestly is like a response to trauma in some way or another. Overcoming the bullshit I overcame in life growing up the way that I did and the belief in how I believed in myself at 16 versus how I believe in myself at 52. I thrive I thrive on it, honestly, I do.
Well, one thing that's always guided me in self reflection and really being true to myself is I love this quote by Carl Jung, and I've used it so much in my life to really reflect on what is going on with me subconsciously. Was it says, everything that irritates us about others leads us to a greater understanding of
Oh, so
ourselves.
true. That's good.
And so anytime I get really triggered by somebody or somebody really pushes my buttons, I go back and I reflect on why are they pushing my buttons so much? Because it's clear we have people in our lives that definitely do more than others, but there's always something in it about me that I'm learning in that process afterwards, and it's been so valuable to me in self-reflection because I'm like, okay, things will come up, people will come into my life that will help me self-reflect, and I can use those experiences to self-reflect. But I may get irritated in the moment, but later on I can reflect on, okay, what was it about that? And a lot of times it goes back to shame.
That damn shame popping up again.
That damn shame. My gosh.
I think shame leads the majority of people, especially in 2022, especially what we've experienced in this country over the past 5 years, especially how people talk down to people. It is 100% shame. My parents, our parents' generation, the boomers, our generation, Gen X, I think we all grew up in the era of shame. And you don't
Mhm.
talk about things, not only just like blatant name calling, you're stupid, you're not going to amount to anything, that sort of thing. And a lot of people grew up that way. A lot of it was very blunt, but a lot of it was subtle also. And not talking about things in society, not talking about race, not talking about religion. And you got people that tell you all the time, I don't talk about politics and religion. Why don't you talk about politics and religion? It all goes back to a shame. Talking about race, talking about sexuality, not talking about trauma, not talking about abuse, not talking about rape, not talking about whatever. It's a level of shame.
Grief.
Yeah, it's a level of shame that guides the lack of that conversation. And then also, this one really hit me when I came to realize that my trauma trigger is deep in shame. That's my trauma trigger, which I've realized.
You're right. There's a lot of things that we didn't talk about. The subtle thing I grew up with is I wasn't allowed to have big feelings. And I had a lot of big feelings, but I wasn't allowed to express them too much.
It doesn't matter what you feel. Yeah, get
Right.
over it. But, we grew up being not able to talk about things. And one of the things that I find really interesting with that is that when it comes to shame, when we're trying to make someone else feel better, when we're trying to say, "Hey, I relate to you because this happened to me," that's coming from shame because it makes us uncomfortable. So we're trying to fix the situation when in fact, we should just be saying, I understand. I'm here for you. What does support look like for you? How can I help you? It isn't what we think we should be doing in that moment. It's how the person who is being hurt or going through the experience, it's how they want you and need you to be there. So we actually have to get good at asking that question, empathizing with them. That's hard. I understand. How can I be there for you? What does support look like for you right now? And that's a Brene Brown thing. What does support look like for you right now? And I think that is so powerful because I am as guilty as anybody for that. When anybody is going through anything in my life, I always try to fix it. I take on their emotions instead of like, I understand and I relate to you. I take on their emotions and I try to be the fixer. And
Yes.
that is a trauma response. That is me going back and feeling those feelings and those emotions that I grew up with and trying to make that person feel better. And that is not what we should be doing in those situations. In those situations, we need to be there for that person how they need us to be there. We're making it about us if we do that and not about the other person. And we as a society do that so much. Everybody does it. Everybody I know does that.
I just posted about that actually. I found this really good list. I forgot where I saw this list, but it was about the idea of don't be instructive, be supportive. because that's what people tend to want to do. It was all the things we say to people to try to be like super positive with them, but we're missing the boat because we're not supporting them.
Right.
So like if I come up to you and you start spilling your heart out to me about something that happened to you, and I say something like, it's all going to work out for the good.
Yes.
Would you not want to slap me? Would you not literally, I
Yeah,
mean,
that's a form of shame. That is a form of shame. It's really important to learn the true definitions of what empathy is, the true definition of what compassion is, the true definition of what shame is, because we think we know the definitions to these words, but we really don't. We really don't understand what a definition of these words are. And how we're expressing how we're feeling, we mislabel it a lot because we don't understand the true definition of words. And because of that, we're not healing. I'm speaking on a very personal level here. This is for me. When that's happening and when I'm doing that, I thought I was extending empathy to somebody, but I'm not. What I'm doing is I'm pushing shame and judgment onto them and making them feel worse about themselves and about the situation.
yes. Well, you're not giving them a voice, number one, because you basically minimized what they just said. And second, you're giving them advice, basically, which is not empathetic at all.
No, and advice more often than not, people get offended if you don't listen to their advice.
Right.
I've been offended in the past when people didn't listen to my advice. It's like, "Well, then, screw you. Don't ask me for help then." It's like they weren't asking me for what I was giving them. I wasn't giving them what they were asking for. I was giving them what I felt they needed to make myself feel better.
Most people don't take our advice. Yeah. We give advice because we make ourselves feel better and we feel like we're doing something, and it comes from often from a place of shame where we feel like we have to keep them from feeling bad. So we're depriving them of their feelings in a way, and we're not hearing them. If you hear somebody, if you really hear them, you're not trying to tell them anything. You're just trying to show active listening. But people are very quick to come back with advice and not just sit with what you've just been told by this person.
Right, and I think really comes down to that is the comfort level for people. You're making yourself feel better because you're uncomfortable with their feelings, and you're not letting them feel what they need to feel and deal with what they need to deal with. You're trying to control. It's controlling behavior. And it was a hard pill for me
It
to
is.
swallow, but when I was made aware of it, oh my gosh, was it a light bulb going off. It, like, literally connected every last dot that I had. I see that play out in society. Now I'm seeing it everywhere. Now I see it all around me, and I see it in how people are interacting with each other, even, strangers. It's just how society is acting with each other.
Absolutely. We don't have very good emotional
No,
intelligence.
gosh, no. Even if you think you do, you really learn that you don't.
So I wanted to segue too to talking about post traumatic growth, because post traumatic growth really goes beyond healing from trauma, and it shows a phase of development, where people are not just recovering, but they're thriving, right? They're in a thriving state in their current life. And there's actually been work done to identify what post traumatic growth looks like. So I wanted to share some of those things. I mean, I could see these things being useful, this kind of growth being so wonderful for a variety of issues that we may come in, or barriers we deal with. There's 5 categories, and they're spiritual development, personal strength, close relationships, greater appreciation of life, and new possibilities. And I'm taking this from a chart, and so I'll definitely reference this in our podcast notes. But it's basically each one kind of talks about what was the catalyst for change for that post traumatic growth. It reminds me a little bit of what you were talking about, where you were connecting all the
Yeah, all of
dots.
that sounds exactly where I'm at right now. Post realization and post learning about my own triggers.
Because it says the change catalyst for greater appreciation for life is certainly a state of gratitude, but the catalyst for change is upheaval in major assumptions about the world and one's place in it. And that's what it kind of reminds me of when you were talking about how you were connecting all the dots. But the ultimate state of greater appreciation for life is a state of gratitude. And we've often in the counseling circles used gratitude as a tool to help people with existential despair and a sense of meaning, loss of meaning, we'll often talk about making gratitude lists and focusing on 3 things you're grateful for, just to get that person into a state of thinking differently. But a person in post-traumatic growth is really at a state where they're kind of like in a permanent state of that. Of course, they have issues and they have down days, but they're in a state of absolute appreciation for the life they have. Another one is new possibilities. And the change catalyst for this kind of post traumatic growth is acceptance of the breakage and formulation of revised goals in the changed life circumstances. So once you realize that things have been broken, once you realize that you experienced acute or complex trauma, you accept that and then you revise your goals in accordance.
Oh, I can speak to that. That is completely true. Not like my life goals. My life goals haven't switched, but communication goals, how I interact with people, a 180. 180.
It's like the state where you start to think, I can do things again, and you may have to repivot yourself, but it's a state of really feeling like you have new perspective, new interests, and your
Yeah, well,
openness.
for me, it's not new interests, perspective, I would say for sure. My life goals are still exactly the same, but I will say this, I have more belief in myself. I've always believed in myself and my ability, but I've also allowed the shame to kinda hold me back a little bit, and sometimes the unconscious part of that creeps up into my consciousness, and, some people would call it fear. But now I don't define my fear by the term fear now. I define it by shame. It was a level of shame because it was me being told that I wasn't good enough and I was stupid, I was dumb, whatever I was called growing up, worthless, whatever. I know what I'm capable of in life and I always have. I've always allowed my trauma to lead that, I think. And I've always allowed my trauma to let me doubt that. And so now that I have this clarity that it's not fear, it's shame, it's gone. I truly believe that I'm never going to question myself when it comes to when an idea pops into my head and I wanna move forward with it. I don't think I'm ever gonna question myself again to say, "Are you good enough to do this?" Where I've always questioned
Oh, yeah.
myself, "Are you good enough to do this?"
Yes.
That is the difference for me.
So in essence, your shame becomes what?
For me, it becomes power.
Some would say
Yeah, it flips it on its
self-acceptance
head.
or
Self-love. Self-love,
self-love.
there you go.
Uh-huh.
That's the perfect term for it, self-love. It literally has done a 180, and so the question of whether or not I can do this or not is no longer a question. I absolutely can do it. It's a matter of do I want to do it now?
Right. And that is a lot of growth because it shows that you're not bound by the same subconscious states that you were in when you were dealing with your PTSD and
I'm
trying to
free.
recover from it.
That's how I look at it. I'm completely free.
Free,
Now, will
freedom.
my behaviors, like, automatically change 100%? Probably not. I'm sure there's still certain things that I'm gonna have to stop and catch myself from doing just because it's more out of habit, probably, at this point since I'm 52 years old. But I'll tell you the way that I talk to people now, it has done a 180. And it's just a matter of flipping a few words around. The way I talk to myself every day now has done a 180. And it's just moving a few words around because of how it's implied and how I would think of myself in those moments. I will never talk down to myself again, ever. It'll never happen. I'll never doubt myself again. I'll never doubt my ability to do anything. I'll never doubt whether I'm good enough to be in this relationship, whether I'm good enough to do this task, whether I'm good enough to have this career goal. Now, as I said, it's a matter of is this what I want? Does this fit with the direction that I'm going? Because I am not going to conform myself to something. I'm not going to allow myself to get comfortable because I'm afraid to do something or I don't believe I can do it. Does that make sense? I'm never
Yes.
going to question myself like that again. I'm never going to not believe in myself again.
I'm not 100% sure I won't do it again. I mean, I'd like to say that, but shame has been a part of my story for so long that I'm not 100% sure, even though I consciously know I don't need to doubt myself anymore. I mean, I'm definitely working on now trying to really tap into those still subtle parts of me that hold back because I think there's still certain parts of me that come forward and try to hold me back to prevent me from being
Ah,
disappointed or
I'm okay with that. I'm okay with disappointment and I'm okay with failure because I have this firm belief that it's a part of growth. And nothing that anybody does is ever going to be perfect. Nothing that you do is going to be perfect. Nothing that I do is ever going to be perfect. And failure is a part of learning. And I have a firm belief in that. And I think that's why I'm not afraid to take chances.
but I also know that I've had depression for years and I've definitely treated my depression for years, but I also know that when my depression creeps in, self-doubt creeps in. It's like part of the
I
package.
don't know that I've ever been depressed. I don't think that I have. So I think there's a difference, right? And that goes back to people's traumas being different and their experiences being different. And what works for one person isn't going to work for another person. But
Right.
the tie-in here is that the way you talk to yourself, how you believe in yourself, the way and your belief has a lot to do with how you talk to yourself. But I think even in times of like depression or in times of where I know I won't question my ability to do something ever again, unless it's something that I know I absolutely cannot do, you know? But like, doing starting these podcasts and this new trajectory of life after COVID, it didn't scare me. It like invigorated me. What I have done in my life because I've questioned myself, I've settled is what I did. I settled for careers that I wasn't happy in to try to make a buck.
Yep.
Just prior to COVID, about a year before COVID, I used to own and operate community magazines, and I did it for 6 years. And I look back now and I absolutely hated it. And I was supposed to be inspired by the people who were around me. And it had the opposite effect because it was all about making money. And that's not who I am as a person. I know this about myself. So when I put myself in situations where what I'm supposed to do with life and how everybody tells me I should be going, it's all about a job, it's all about money. I know about me that sure, money's awesome and you need money to survive in the world and in life, but I am not going to do something just for money. And I put myself in that position where that job was all about making money. It was a franchise setup. You were judged by the powers that be based on how much money you made, based on how many ads you sold. And I always had the problem with selling advertising to a small business that I knew it wasn't going to work for and that they really didn't have a ton of money to put in this. And so if they put the money into this, it really needed to work for them. And I knew it wasn't going to work for them the way they wanted it to because it just doesn't work that way. So I didn't push it and I didn't sell it. So I wasn't quote unquote successful in their mind because I wasn't making 20 grand a month. I made half that. So I wasn't good enough, which is really interesting because I think a part of my trauma is where I also put myself into situations where I wasn't good enough because it kind of reinforced that shame. I didn't do it consciously, though, is the thing. I put myself in
No.
relationships that I didn't want, that I knew were bad for me and that didn't work. I knew it. I knew it. I can count how many times I did that for myself. I put myself in careers and jobs that I knew didn't work for me. So it was like I was almost reinforcing that trauma as a child throughout my entire life until I realized what I was doing and stopped. I know what I'm capable of. And putting myself into environments and situations, into career goals, into relationships where that part of me thrives is what I think I was always afraid of. I think that's really what I've learned out of this. And I don't know that I've ever been depressed. I don't think I've ever been depressed. I think I've had moments where I felt depressed, but I don't think it was true depression, if that, you know what I mean? So I can't relate.
Like clinical
Yeah, I can't
depression.
relate to people that have depression. So all I can do is listen.
Well, one of the aspects of depression is definitely irrational thinking. And that irrational thinking comes into play and it tells you things that when you're not as depressed, you probably wouldn't think. So, of course, the ultimate irrational thinking comes with suicidal thoughts, but there's any number of irrational thinking that comes in before that, self doubt, self deprecation.
Is that a part of depression? That's all part of depression? So, well, maybe I was depressed as a kid then too. All of that was there when I was a child.
Well, it's part of depression in conjunction with a lot of other symptoms. I mean, here's what depression is to me. I'm one of many scenarios, but some people sleep too much. That's definitely me when I'm depressed. Some people sleep too little. Some people eat too much. Some people eat too little. I'm definitely a stress eater, but I'm not a
I'm a
depressed
stress
eater.
eater.
I'm
I'm a
more of a
stress eater. I am.
I'm a stress eater. So when I'm depressed, I tend to sleep a lot and eat less. But I don't have much energy. They call it anhedonia. That's another hallmark of depression. But some people become almost overly energetic. So, it just depends. But the negative thinking, the negative cognitions are a part of it. But also feeling hopeless is a big thing with depression, just that feeling of hopelessness. And to me, it's always like impending doom. Like it's more than impending doom. It's hopelessness about now, and it's the fact that it's not going to get better. So it's more like the world is crappy and the world's never going to change, and none of this matters. So that's kind of how my cognition goes when I'm depressed. But different people have different cognitions. So it definitely affects my thinking when depression is more prominent for me. So I have to be aware of that because I know that it's not a permanent state, right? That once I come through that depression, my thinking's going to improve and I'm not going to be as harsh on myself as I am when I'm depressed. So that's why I say I can't 100% guarantee I'm not going to ever have a self-doubting thought because depression it tends to come and go, or episodes of depression tend to come and go even when you're being treated for it. People who've been on medications and in therapy for years can still have a depressive episode where they're, in bed for 2 weeks and can't get out of bed.
Well, I mean, that makes sense. You're still human.
And it's still a chronic illness. Depression is not treated like heart disease or diabetes. It's treated like, an episodic thing, but it's really a chronic illness that you have to treat over your lifespan. Now, some people do eventually have spontaneous recovery, but until that point, it's important that you don't expect spontaneous recovery and you treat your depression just like you would any other illness that you carry and that you get the proper help for it and you assume that it's not going to go away just by itself. And so there's a lot of stigma around that, of course, where people don't treat it and they try to just muster their way through it, white knuckle it, as they
For
say.
me, I think the self-doubt is gone now. And I'm at a point in my life where I'm not gonna do something I don't wanna do ever again for any amount of money. It's not gonna happen. I'm well past that. Will I not lead from shame ever again? I can't guarantee that because I'll still be triggered, right? I mean, that's not gone. It's just I understand it now. I can physiologically feel when I'm triggered. I always have been able to feel it, but now I understand it and I know what's behind it, and so I can regulate myself better, and I can remove myself from the situation now, whereas before I would plow through like an Emma, like a motherfucker. Would. I would plow through when I was triggered before I really understood what was behind my trigger, I would plow through without any empathy for people with I didn't care. I didn't care.
The thing about post traumatic growth doesn't mean that you're not going to have those moments. Everyone, no matter how much recovery and growth they do after trauma, is going to have moments. And it doesn't mean that you're not still in a state of growth because, really post traumatic growth is about shifting, but it's not about saying, oh, I'll never have a bad day
Oh
again,
gosh, no.
right?
I don't believe I'll never have a bad day for sure. I think I've got a really good grasp on my self-doubt now because I understand it. But I know I will struggle coming from a place of shame toward other people. I will have to stop myself.
Well, that's the problem with subconscious reactions is we consciously know it. Like I consciously know what my issues are, but subconsciously the work that's going on under the surface that I don't recognize is sometimes can still rise up, but it doesn't debilitate me like it used to. I mean, I still feel as though I have those moments, but I feel like I'm able to address them appropriately when they do come up. But I do know that another aspect of trauma, and this is important that people understand too, is that you may have post traumatic growth, you may have trauma recovery, but then other traumatic events happen in your life. it's almost like it's a ripple effect, like another traumatic event comes and it kind of stirs up any unconscious material that you haven't addressed. And that is what happened to me 2 years ago because I was feeling pretty good about my trauma recovery and where I was, but I'm also raising a child with developmental trauma. And that child went through some extensive troubles after they hit puberty, and it was troubles with emotional regulation, and it created a lot of unsafe situations for us as a family because they would act out physically, and it was really, really difficult. But the worst part of it was, I mean, the worst part of it is trying to help him and get him the help he needs, but another part of it that really impacted his recovery was that I became triggered in ways that I had not anticipated.
Ah, interesting.
So I became very dysregulated and I did not know how to control it. I was in such a state of dysregulation that I would have panic attacks. I would start sweating profusely and feel like I had to get out of a room and get my clothes stripped down because I just felt like I was burning up from the inside out. I had never experienced anything that intense. Even after my initial trauma, I don't recall having that consistent level of anxiety, but I was in a consistent state of anxiety and it was triggered. And what they call that is secondary trauma because I was traumatized by my child's trauma reactions. And I did not anticipate how that secondary trauma would stir me up. And that's when I went and did EMDR because I realized that if I didn't treat myself, I was going to impede my own child's recovery because he was trying to deal with things that had happened to him in early life that he had no control over. Coming from foster care, he was extremely delayed in his capacity to regulate his emotions. And that in turn traumatized me and made me very dysregulated. And I would have never guessed that that was going to happen. I would have never, if you could have told me, okay, at some point you're going to have secondary trauma and you're going to be in a very dysregulated state, just like your kid, I'd said, you're crazy. I've done all this work. I'm set. I'm set. I had no idea. And I credit my therapist and the work that she did with me to kind of help put me back to baseline because I was a mess. And I don't know that another thing is going to come up. Maybe not with my child, but
Right, you make a good point there. I don't know either. I don't something could happen in my life that throws me off kilter again. I really don't know that. Yeah,
exactly.
so I
We
take back
don't
what I
know what's going to
said.
happen.
I really don't know.
I'm not telling you to
I'm going
take
to
back what
because
you
you just made
said,
me
but
realize that anything is possible. Dealing with my current trauma, I know I've got a firm grasp on that, I believe now. If something else happens to me in the future, I have no idea how I'm going to respond. I can't know.
no one can. It's absolutely impossible. And you know what? It doesn't mean that what you're doing now doesn't matter because I know that the work I'd done on my previous trauma helped me to recognize that I was in a state of trauma and I needed to get back and get some tools and get some help. So I think even if you've experienced all this post traumatic growth and life throws you a huge curveball and you experience more traumatic symptoms, you've had that experience of healing, and that's going to help you in the future.
Sure, and I think too, I've had a lot of highly stressful experiences in my life. I grew up the way that I did. I went through a devastating divorce after 14 years of marriage. My divorce brought me to my knees. It really did. It was unexpected. The way things happened and the way they rolled out, it's almost surreal to me. I became a single mom, 100% single parent. It's like my ex-husband has chosen to not be in my child's life. And for the past 11 years, he has not been. In the beginning, that was devastating to me. It did take me back to my childhood. And in a sense, it was worse. I think if my husband would have died, it would have been easier to deal with than what happened. I felt it then, and I feel the same way now because of the path he chose to take with it, not because of divorce itself.
The divorce, his
His
reaction
reaction,
to the
right,
divorce.
what led to divorce and what's happened since. My ex was in IT. We were at the height of the dot-com boom, in the early 2000s, living the high life in San Francisco, California. And when that bust happened,
Mm.
it happened to us. We lost our shit, we lost everything, and we had to move out of state and start over. And we did, and we started over, and we started over and built up again, and then the crash in 2008 happened, and we lost
Oh,
everything
yeah.
again and had to start from the bottom up again. And then I had divorce, which I had to start over again. So I've had all of these really, really high highs and really low lows all throughout my adult life, as well as growing up in an abusive home with a very abusive father. Love you, dad, but we reconciled, but still. I had a very abusive upbringing and then had all these highs and really low lows as an adult multiple times, having to start over, and then COVID happened. COVID happened and I lost everything again and had to start over, and this is a result of starting over. But now I've had all of these really incredibly stressful experiences in life, which all kind of triggered me every time they happened, except for COVID. COVID didn't trigger me the way being up and then down multiple times in my life did previously. I actually looked at this in a different way, and I looked at this as an incredible opportunity to really start over and really do what I want now. Because before, I was just doing what I felt I had to do to raise my son and to live the lifestyle that we lived, focusing on, him following his dreams. And after COVID, and I lost everything again and started over again. And it's a struggle, it's still a struggle to build back up, but I'm not worried about it now. I'm not worried about it. And I don't look at it as a negative, and it didn't trigger me in the way that all of the other ones triggered me. It didn't take me back to my childhood this time. And there was no, "Oh, poor me" in this one. There was no I didn't feel sorry for myself this time around. I didn't the negative stuff didn't come out of my mouth like, "Of course this happened. Yes, again." Like it did every other time. It's like, "Why wouldn't this happen to me? Of course it would." We always talked about growing up, like, I have the Graham curse. My family, they still do it. My mom still tries to throw that shit at me, and I'm just like, "No, no, you're not putting negativity into this. You're not doing it this time around."
Don't speak it into existence.
So I feel like I have grown so much, and I'm just so sad that it takes you till you're 52 years old to realize 50 years old to realize this stuff sometimes. But because of all of those highs and lows, I get less and less triggered in life, but there's certain things that still triggered me, and it had to do with personal relationships is where it was. Because that's where my trauma really was as a child. It was in personal relationships with my family, with the people that were supposed to protect me and love me the most. So, I didn't learn what I needed to learn as far as relationships go up until this past year. I really feel that. The past 5 or 6 years, I really started recognizing it, but up until this past year, I didn't learn what I really needed to learn. And now, with this awareness of this shame and leading with this shame, it just, like, changes everything for me. I hope I'm never triggered like that again. I really hope that I'm not.
I do too. I do too. So I'm going to post on the website. There is a questionnaire about post traumatic growth, and it goes through the 5 factors. So I'm going to post that in our notes, that link in our notes, as well as the diagram. So if people just want to know where they are and if they've experienced trauma, acute or complex trauma, and they want to know, like, where am I in the growth process? It's like a 21 question questionnaire, and each question relates to a different factor. So your factor 2, new possibilities, would have a question like, I am able to do better things with my life. So you would just answer each one, true or false. Something about appreciation of life. Factor 5 might say something like, I changed my priorities about what is important in life. So it's really cool that you can kind of measure where you are in your post traumatic growth. And of course, that doesn't always stay. And then this is more of a true false. No, it's really a 5 point scale. I'm sorry. It's a 0 to 5 scale. So it's not true false, it's 0 to 5. So, you might have some growth in some areas, but just like with resilience, you can have growth in one of the factors and less growth in other factors. I mean, it's not like a perfect circle. So I see growth as, not an endpoint, but just kind of a continual road and a continual path. So That's what I see post-traumatic growth is. It's just a path that we're on. We may some people may be further down the path, but that's okay. We're all trying to grow and learn to deal with our
Well, I think healing is a
experiences.
very personal thing, right? It's not each individual person's healing is going to be very different from the next. It's a very personal thing. So even if, say someone went through a similar trauma that I did, I can relate to them and understand. But, and this is where I got it wrong previously too, what works for me isn't going to work for them necessarily. I'm
Right.
someone who really likes to talk about it because it helps me therapeutically to talk about it. And, I had a friend who went through something very similar that I did, and he couldn't talk about it, and I always tried to push him to talk about it because it made me feel better to talk about things, so I thought it would make him feel better to talk about things, and that's just a perfect example of
Yes.
where I pushed my own I pushed shame onto him and judgment onto him without even realizing that I was doing it. My heart and my intentions were in the right place. I was not practicing empathy in those situations. I was practicing judgment and shame in those situations and trying to make myself feel better.
Doing it Tamara's
Yes, doing it
way.
Tamara's way. Now, I completely understand the empathetic side of it and how to approach that in the future. So in the future, it won't be me trying to push my what worked for me onto anyone else. Unless they specifically ask me for advice and say, "Hey, what worked for you?" Even then, it's like, "This is what worked for me," but I would always have to follow up saying, "It may not necessarily work for you. Figure out what works for you." Talk to somebody to figure that out, and it may not be me, probably isn't me. Um, but have a conversation with somebody who can help you figure out what's gonna work for you, and then how can I be there for you? What can I do to help you? It's such a simple question. It's such a simple question, and it's not
Yeah.
that I didn't ask.
What can I do to
Yes, and it's
help?
not that I didn't ask those questions before. I asked the question and then also pushed on what my belief was and what should be done, right? And what my experience was, and so you should try this because it worked for me type of thing. And it just doesn't work for people. And then you make people feel terrible about themselves. And that's the last thing I want to do to someone that I love. The last thing I want to do is to make them feel bad. The last thing I want to do to anybody is to make them feel how I felt growing up. I wouldn't do that to my worst damn enemy. And my dad was my worst enemy for 27 years of my life. And I look back on that situation, and the things that we would say to each other, holy hell. It was a vicious circle. It was a vicious cycle. It truly was. But I got out of it. And I didn't say that stuff to him ever again. The stuff that I said growing up to him, I was him. What he said to me, I said to him. I was him. And so that really makes me pause, especially now with the whole shame thing. It's like, you are not that person. That is not who you are. So don't be that person.
It's really hard to do for kids because they do see themselves through the lens of their
As a kid, I
parents.
didn't know better. I really didn't know better.
Right. Kids don't understand that they are not exactly like their parent. They have similarities in some ways, but they don't have those skills yet, and it's just so sad that so many kids are in these situations that they really don't know how to talk about it, can't talk about, or unsafe talking about, and they don't know how to navigate it. They're kinda lost. You were kinda
I was totally
lost.
lost. I was 100%. I had nobody that could relate to me when I was growing up, not one person.
Your grandmother.
She was there for me. I don't know that she necessarily related to me, but she was there for me. She was my
So
person.
that was your
She
protective
was.
factor was
She
your grandmother.
100% was. So, going back to this list of 7 things, I really hope that these can be implemented in schools across the country, and I would suggest that any parent listening to this, we're gonna post this in our show notes, to start approaching your children from this point of view. I'm going to. I'm gonna have a conversation with my son on all of these points now. I think they're all critical. Because I think the end goal is we don't want our children to grow up to have to recover from their childhoods. That should be our number one goal as parents,
Exactly.
to where
We don't teach children how to emotionally navigate the world. I mean, we often like neglect that part of their development. We teach them how to tie their shoes, we teach them how to ride a bike, we teach them how to, learn math and all these things, but how do you emotionally navigate through difficulties and pain? We don't teach them that. Or, maybe some families do, but we don't, as
As a
a
society, we
society,
don't.
teach
Sure.
them
Not
that.
all families are pull yourself up from the bootstraps, but that's the mentality we have. It's like, suck it up, don't talk about it, deal with it, pull yourself up from the bootstraps and just move forward. And then in the interim, you've got people have all of this internal chaos going on that affects every aspect of their life, especially men. I think how we raise men in this society is beyond abusive. It is horrific how we
Yes.
raise men to be.
We teach them to not share their feelings at all
Exactly. We
costs.
teach them to not be human. And then we're surprised when they don't behave human, and then we punish them for not being human. I mean, then we punish them for behaving as if they're not human. It's really horrific.
We don't allow boys to have big feelings or express big feelings in any other way except physical, which is definitely not a coping skill. It's a lack of emotional regulation when you have to physically act out. And kids can learn to regulate that, boys and girls, but it takes people in their environment to teach them that if they're acting out physically, that there's other ways to express themselves that are fine and perfect to do. I mean, a boy should be able to talk about his feelings as much as a girl should. Maybe he wants to go fishing while he does it, which is fine. Studies have found that boys can talk better and men can talk better when they're doing something, right? If they're playing pool, they can talk, or if they're driving the car, they can talk, but just sitting face to face is very uncomfortable
Oh,
for a
yeah.
lot of
And
men.
they don't want to. They don't want to have conversations in that type of environment. They don't want to open up. They don't want to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is the key to really making change in anything in life.
Right.
It's the key to any successful relationship. Any successful relationship, if vulnerability is not present, you are not in a successful relationship. You are not in a happy relationship if there's no vulnerability going on.
No, you're not taking the risk of vulnerability, and therefore you're not receiving the rewards of vulnerability, which are truer,
Yeah,
deeper
intimacy.
connection.
It's so important. Intimacy, not in a sexual way, just, emotional intimacy with people. Whether it's your son, whether it's your father, whether it's your partner, whether it's your brother, vulnerability has to be there.
I know.
Stuff is just so fascinating to me. I love it. I wish we could, I wish it could be a required part of school. It needs to be a required part of school because just so many adults lack these basic skills, the basic awareness of this stuff. Today, Leisha and I both shared with you our individual experiences with our own respective trauma, healing, and growth following PTSD. Traumatic experiences are more common than many realize, but anyone can support those who suffer from trauma by understanding more about trauma and what healing looks like. Sometimes just having one person who steps up to support can make all the difference in the world, especially to a child with trauma. We are often powerless over what we experience in life, but we are not powerless over our healing. Simple strategies such as clear boundaries can make all the difference in the world, as well as understanding what drives our behaviors after trauma. With both of our respective traumas, Leisha and I both shared that we were driven by shame. Understanding trauma collectively as a society can help each of us navigate through the world and our interactions with empathy rather than judgment. We are all better humans when we purposefully practice these skills with self-awareness and intention through all of our interactions. If you or someone you love is suffering from PTSD, you will find some helpful resources in our show notes. We continue the conversation on post-traumatic trauma and healing in our private Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/humanhood podcast. Please join us there to continue the conversation. Thank you for listening to this episode of Humanhood. We are happy you are here. For a breakdown of this episode, please visit pcspodcast.com/humanhood for our show notes and for more information on how you can get involved. If you enjoyed this podcast, please help us grow by giving us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts and supporting us through Patreon by becoming a founding member. As a founding patron, you receive a special subscription rate that will lock in for the life of your subscription. We provide our patrons with a plethora of awesome behind-the-scenes perks and special merchandise, along with access to our Patreon-exclusive podcasts, Drunk Politics and WTF. Become a founding member today at patreon.com/powerfulpodcasts or find the link in our show notes. This podcast is brought to you by Powerful Podcasts and is written, produced, and hosted by me, Tamara Graham, with co-host Alicia Moody Miller. You can find us at pcspodcast.com or wherever you find your podcasts. For a full list, please refer to our website. Follow us on social media at Powerful Podcasts and on Twitter at Powerful Pods. Be sure to join us next week for another powerful episode of Humanhood.